from the basic. Yeah. All right. Well, welcome everybody. Oh, actually, let me grab my notepad. All right. Welcome everybody here in person and on Zoom. My name is Robin Prasker here with the City of Eureka Community Services Department. I also have Donna Wood here over Zoom. She's the director of our Community Services Department. And we are the city team responsible for implementing SB 1383. We're honored to have brought Mike here from Abound Food Care to specifically discuss the edible food donation portion of this mandate. But I did want to spend just a quick minute on the other requirements that may affect you as well. And I have, okay. So SB 1383, it is a statewide mandate. It affects every city and county in the state. And we're all in this together. And as a local business, you will be required to subscribe to organics collection when available. The city of Eureka, along with every other city and the county itself, are working on a regional curbside program. So we'll keep you updated as that development progresses. You are here today, most likely because we've identified you as a tier 1 or tier 2 food waste generator. And we're going to touch on that very shortly here with Mike. But basically what that means is you will have to donate all edible food that you can. And lastly, if you provide refuse bins to customers, you will need to offer a 3-bin system with clear labels. And you will need to monitor the bins to make sure both customers, staff, any other patrons to your organization use it correctly. So with that, I am going to hand it off to Mike, who's going to talk everything about edible food recovery, and we'll have lots of time for questions along with any other questions about SB 1383 if you have them. So I'll go ahead and pass it over.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And hopefully I can work the clicker and the microphone at the same time. Thank you for joining us. I appreciate it. As we mentioned, we're going to talk about all things edible food recovery today in Eureka as it pertains to SB 1383. So to start off with, I want to give you some context of why I'm standing here and what my background is with it. Abound Food Care has been around for 10 years. We started as Waste Not OC. We were the first food recovery program in the state to be founded by the public health officer for the county. And I am a food guy. I'm 3rd generation food industry, both as a restaurateur, also distributor, sales rep, poultry processor. So I've really worked in all elements of the food industry. When we started this program 10 years ago, we did it because we knew that the food industry would participate if we mitigated the concerns that they had in donating food. And we knew that it's a valuable food source that we could then send to nonprofit agencies that address food insecurity. So what we're going to go through right now is just an outline of what we're trying to accomplish, how we do it, what the key components of it are. And then we'll also go with questions and kick things around, because really the key is going to be, how does it pertain to your organization or your operation? So let's start with SB 1383, California state mandate, unfunded, which makes things a little bit more difficult because it's up to each jurisdiction to determine how we are going to fund this effort. But it, in essence, dictates that our goal is to reduce organic waste that goes into landfills by 75%, recover 20% of edible food that would otherwise be sent to landfill. And it sets requirements for who has to participate. And those requirements are broken down into tier 1 and tier 2. And then, as you can see, the regulations started in January of 2022. More specifically for SB 1383 food recovery or donation requirements, ultimately the donor will have to have a contract between their organization and the recipient organization, and they'll have to maintain donation logs that show how much food they donated and where it went. Those are the 2 requirements of the law. And then finally, it states that an entity is supposed to donate all of their excess edible food. So that's the letter of the law. Now we'll walk through it in a little bit greater detail. Here's the timeline. You can see January 2020 was when the first start of it. 2022 is when the regulations took effect. 2024, local governments take over the enforcement. And in 2025 is when we have to hit those mandated goals. So here is the definition of tier 1 and tier 2. And one of the roles we play is to identify those locations, those food operations, and identify them as tier 1 and tier 2. You can see tier 1 are supermarkets, grocery stores with a total facility size equal or greater than 10,000 square feet, food service providers, food distributors, wholesale food vendors. Those are the big boys. Those are the tier 1s. That's quite honestly where most of the food comes from. And then we have tier 2, which are smaller in scale. They're restaurants with seating capacity over 250 or total facility size over 5,000 square feet. You'll see hotels. You'll see healthcare facilities with certain room requirements or bed spaces, large venues, large events, state agencies with cafeterias, and then educational agencies with on-site food facilities. So everybody on those lists are supposed to be participating. And now here's the food donation system as it works. First of all, you're going to see in the bottom left, that's what's most important. So again, I come to it from a food industry perspective. It was never about liability. We always knew liability protections were included. The federal Good Samaritan laws and the state of California Good Samaritan laws, which have been enhanced, provide liability protection for food waste generators or for donors of food, providing they know that food is safe and wholesome and has been held and handled correctly. There has never been a successful suit lobbied against a food waste or food donor or generator. Excuse me, I struggle to spit that one out. I don't know why, because that's really important to us. Is no attorney will take that because there are so many protections in place. You have to willfully and knowingly be donating food that will get someone sick to run afoul of the federal Good Samaritan law. So it always came down to brand protection. That was the most important thing. A donor has food. They have spent their life, their time, their effort, their sweat equity in developing a brand, whether it's a small independent operator or whether it's a large national global chain. The brand is everything. The concern was always that food that we donated would be sent to a nonprofit agency that didn't have the resources to handle that food correctly. And somebody ultimately would get sick on it. And then that would come back or be traced back to I as a donor. That was always the greatest concern. So our program was really to mitigate those concerns and protect the brand of the donor and the recipient. So the first thing you'll see is identifying the best partners. One of the elements of the capacity study that we're going through right now is identifying all the nonprofit agencies that could and will and are receiving this food now, and what do they need to safely receive food in order to service all those other remaining tier 1 and tier 2 generators. Contract management is very important. We want to make sure that a donor and the recipient agency have valid contracts in place. Not just to satisfy 1383, but it allows for traceback opportunities. So God forbid there is a foodborne illness. We have that ability to know where that food came from and where it started. And it's just a way of stopping the issue or correcting the issue immediately. Food tracking falls in that same category. And then community enrichment is another opportunity with this. It's another advantage. The ability for a company that makes their living in a certain community to be recognized as someone that helps participate by donating their excess edible food, going to nonprofit agencies that helps alleviate food insecurity. The beauty of edible food donation is that there's a cost benefit to the operator. So I'll kind of walk you through. 10 years ago, we actually started the program in my restaurant to see how it worked, because I didn't want to go to my colleagues in the industry and advocate for something I didn't try. And I was blown away at the cost reductions on my end. So first of all, the first step in donating food is always start tracking how much you're discarding of that edible food and what it is. If you do it every day, you start to notice there's adjustments that can be made. Operational adjustments, meaning how much you produce, and procurement adjustments, inventory control. We're buying too much, we're not moving it, and now I have to get rid of it before it expires or before the recommended sell-by date. The other advantage is a tax deduction on what you donate. The IRS does allow up to 66% of the value of the food. It is up to the donor to determine what the value is of the food. Really simple on an item that you buy and it's not changed in any way. much more difficult on prepared foods. And there's different ways of doing it. We always mention that's between the donor, their CPA, the IRS, and God. It has nothing to do with us. And then finally, reduce waste hauling expenses. So as the cost of waste hauling goes up to satisfy 1383, there's a distinct advantage in being able to donate excess edible food, get that tax deduction, and then also enjoy the benefits of that operational adjustments, what we call source reduction. And it's real. Everybody that participates sees source reduction, whether it's national chain restaurants, which school districts especially have been big recipients or beneficiaries of making operational adjustments once they start tracking their food waste. And then there's also some intangibles as well. And as we mentioned, being associated in your community with something that feeds people is great, but also the staff, especially millennial staff, who have a bigger purpose, and all of a sudden they're not just working in a restaurant or a hotel or a supermarket. In their own way, they're working for a company that's changing, the world, that's saving the environment, that's providing additional food sources to people in need. So we're going to kind of walk through some of the areas here. So just to recap, there's brand protection. That is first and foremost. It's the ability to keep people safe. We're going to receive that food and we're going to get it to the nonprofit agencies that are going to serve that food. And we're going to do it safely by tracking time and temperature. Those are the critical components. If we do that, the donor's brand is now protected. They can show that that food was at a certain temperature when it left, it was received at a certain time, and it was at a certain temperature when it was received. That's the biggest obstacle. 1383 compliance obviously is another benefit. No one runs afoul of the law. No one puts the city or the county in an untenable spot of having to come back to you and identify you and your business as an entity that is not participating. Again, the cost and tax benefits are significant, and then the community impact. And we're going to go one step further on community impact. The one thing I've really enjoyed about being in Humboldt County is in different areas of the state, we see that people are participating to varying degrees. In Humboldt County, I have seen operators, every spectrum, the food banks, the nonprofit, everybody is on board, which is very heartening, and they want to do it for the right reason. And that's huge. So let's take one step further. Ideally, we don't want to just look at this food as the pounds recovered. We don't want to just trade dumpsters. We don't want it to go from a retail grocery store to a nonprofit agency who can't use it because they either don't have enough volunteers to work with the product or the expertise to rework with it, or they just don't need it. We want to avoid that. The idea is let's get that product to where it can be used. And that food is a nutrition source. And so it's not just feeding somebody for another day. It's the basis of all the social determinants of health. So when we look at poverty and we look at homelessness, the one thing that is in common is people have to eat every day. So if we have food where services or our wraparound services, we have a better opportunity to get people the help that they need that will improve their lives. And going beyond that, we also have tools that we incorporate from repurposing kitchens, which are permitted establishments. We'd love to see them happen in this area, to take bulk food from processors, growers, manufacturers, distributors. Culinary education programs could be repurposing kitchens. They can work with that food, create meals, and then get that to nonprofit agencies that can serve it. With the right type of packaging and blast freezing, you extend the shelf life of end-of-life food. So it's a great way of eliminating that trading of dumpsters that we talked about earlier. And then also we've worked on other solutions like sharing logistics. In other words, a lot of times there is funding coming through for nonprofit agencies. And typically it's in the form of assets, meaning it's got to be something tangible. Can't be for services, can't be for administrative. They want to provide that actual asset, whether it's cold storage or whether it's a refrigerated truck. The problem is, again, we're reliant on volunteers many times, or with rising costs right now, especially of fuel, sometimes it's too expensive to operate that truck fully. So we tend to have underutilized resources. What we will help with and want to see happen is being able to coordinate those resources that are available so that we're able to get the work done, maximize it, and augment what's already being done by the food banks, the nonprofit agencies. So in a nutshell, That's how food recovery and excess edible food donation works. But the key is going to be to kick around some of the details of it. What type of food is accepted? What type isn't? What are some of the challenges we've seen? And we have to be very honest and crystal clear in how this has worked all up and down the state and across the country. The dynamics that we're working with. And typically food banks will work with tier ones. They're reticent about working with tier two. And that's where agencies and nonprofit recipients can be the recipient of those tier two meals. It's also what we call the 80-20 principle. 80% of the risk and the expense is going to go towards receiving 20% of the food. It's just really difficult, much more difficult to receive food from restaurants and hotels, et cetera. But it's got to be done. And there is still a market for it, meaning there's still a recipient for that. So as we've walked through the program, we wanted to make sure that we were able to capture for everybody who's watching this, what are some of the dynamics we're going to face and how does the process work? Okay, so the first step is a capacity study mandated by the state of California. And again, that's our role right now, is to identify who are the tier one generators, who are the tier two generators, how much have you been donating, how much do you think you have to donate? And then the nonprofit agencies. Here's what you've been doing now through the food bank, outside of the food bank, whatever that network might be. And then what do you need to receive more food or to handle food safely? That's the steps that we're going through right now. Once we complete the capacity study, it's a puzzle. We look at all the pieces and we kind of provide a roadmap moving forward. And the whole idea again is to be able to do this effectively, meaning we keep the product safe and we're not just going through the activity of recovering food and sending it to a nonprofit. We're looking at the impact that that food can have. We're recovering food that can actually feed people. All right, so with that, I can take questions, whether it's coming from online or anybody here with me right now. And until we get the first question, I'm going to pick on those of you who were foolish enough to come in person. Okay, so school district or school, right there. Is it a district, public school, or private or charter? Public charter. Middle school or K-12. Okay. Have you guys, and you don't have to give the name, but have you guys been donating? Have you started donating excess edible food yet?
A little bit. We only feed about 15 kids a day.
Okay. Oh, good.
Is there a threshold in terms of how many students are feeding?
Yeah. Well, people will always ask, what's the minimum? In other words, what's worth it? And the reality, the answer is whatever the market will bear. In other words, if you have a nonprofit agency that perhaps has an after-school program near your school, that could be a logical fit or connection. But if no one wants that item, they are not obligated to take it. Great example is we have across the state and around the country right now, an excess of bread, a plethora of bread, as we say. We're choking on bread. And we get so much bread coming because, quite honestly, it's inexpensive to produce. We don't have a glut of lobster tail. We have a glut of bread. And in the past, agencies, nonprofit agencies, have been asked or expected to take in one fell swoop whatever excess food was at this location. Now, that agency has the ability to say, I can only take what we can use. I can't take the rest. That's the more intelligent, prudent way. So to answer your question, if there's a recipient agency close by that can use that food, great. If there is no agency close by, it's very difficult to participate. Okay. I'll get back to you on the threshold on if there's a head count on how many students.
Mike, I would add one more thing. We have a chat question, but also I would just add, I'll come over to the microphone, is that if you end up with one muffin or one milk every now and then, that's fine, but you have to have a contract in place. Even if you never use the contract, you got to have it in place for that instance when you do have something. So I wanted to highlight that.
Perfect.
Okay, Mike, so I'll go ahead and read the question out. So this is from Steve Masson. I hope I'm saying that right, Steve. We are a refrigerated wholesale food distributor. Everything we sell is prepackaged. The only food we throw out are items past the sell-by date. How does this law affect us?
Great question. Great question. The reality is that there are no uniform coding. There are no dates that are uniform. There are suggested, manufacturers suggested sell-by dates. So with distributors, there's two different ways of going. Some distributors have internal processes in place in which they have to donate that food 2 weeks before their manufacturer's suggested sell-by date. Other retailers and other distributors will wait until it's no longer able to be used, meaning it's past that sell-by date. You can donate food that's past its manufacturer's sell-by date. It is a matter of knowing, and there are guidelines that we can provide through Eureka. There are guidelines that you can look at to determine what is acceptable. So for example, canned goods, unless the can is dented from the inside out or dented at the crease where you open the can, either the top or bottom, that has a very long past its sell-by life, up to a year plus. So there's still an element of when in doubt, throw it out, meaning if you're not sure something is safe, be safe, don't donate. But you can sell and donate product that's past its sell-by date within reason. Steve, I hope that answered the question. And do we have any other questions on there? Okay, so I'm going to ask a question now. Anybody can answer, either here or on the chat. What do you see as the biggest pain point, fear, scary thing about donating excess edible food, either as a recipient of that food or as a food generator, a donor? I want to know what the biggest fear is. Yep, the answer was basically delivery or pickup, the ability to safely move that food. And that's so important. It's very critical. And there's different ways of doing that. Again, refrigerated vehicles, obviously that's a piece of cake. There's also thermal equipment, thermal bags, containers that can be used. The key is to train the people who are going to be picking this food up on how to handle excess edible food. What are the food safety areas? So typically, especially on the nonprofit realm, we have just good-hearted people who want to help out. They want to feed others. And sometimes they might get a little anxious on recovering product that shouldn't be recovered. So the training comes into place of telling and explaining and showing, this is how we handle food. This is how we mitigate food safety. Here's the tools that you need. Thermometer. And then we advocate for a tech platform or something that allows you to track the time at pickup and the time at delivery. If you're able to keep food either under 41 degrees or over 140 degrees, you're able to maintain food safety for a period of time, a safe period of time. And that's why I personally am a big advocate for only handling cold food, unless there's just a real obvious connection, a short distance connection, because it's much more difficult to keep hot food hot than it is to keep cold food cold. And if the donors are the permitted food establishment, they have the environmental health permit and oversight, then they're probably the ones that are best suited for refrigerating that product, getting it to a safe temperature so that it can be distributed. But it can either be done through transportation, cold storage transportation, or cold storage supplies, thermal bags, containers, to be able to track that temperature or maintain that temperature. Do we have any other questions? Sure. Yeah, it's a really good question. It is the establishment location. So your vendor, and we get this a lot with universities, corporate campuses, they may have a third-party contractor, food service contractor that's preparing the food or serving. but it's that location. Right. So it has to be part of the agreement that you have with the food service contractor. What's going to be, how are you going to use the excess edible food, or what are you going to do with it? Sometimes there's share tables at schools where they'll, especially before COVID, there were share tables. I'm sure that'll come back at some point. So sometimes it's the ability. Yeah. It's the ability to get that food to other classmates. In other cases we've had, and there's a variety of different ways of mitigating this excess food. In some cases, it goes back to, as we mentioned, an after-school program close by, where the kids who didn't want that banana at lunch will probably have that banana at 3:30 in the afternoon or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. In larger districts or larger schools, many times, and we have one charter school in Southern California that has a culinary program. So 7th and 8th graders are actually repurposing this food. They have raised sustainable beds. They're learning about sustainable farming and about food waste reduction, and they're feeding families in that school with the excess edible food. At community colleges, especially those that have culinary programs, we have one that has a state-of-the-art kitchen, 9 kitchens, actually, one just dedicated to food recovery. And it's a great dynamic or circular dynamic within the pantry that's on campus. So the students will go to that on-campus pantry. The food that's left over at the pantry that they can't move will go to the culinary program, where the students will make something completely different, meals ostensibly, vacuum seal them, blast freeze them, goes back to the pantry as a frozen meal. So there's this zero waste within the campus. So there's different ways schools can participate, different ways of mitigating excess edible food, both small schools and large schools. And what kind of school district or school? Okay, very good. Is there a central kitchen? Yeah, some school districts also, the food matriculates in reverse. So it's reversing the process. So if food goes from a central kitchen to the schools, the next morning, that same driver will pick up and take it back to the central kitchen, where sometimes they are doing the repurposing, or they may be just handling the logistics and they be moving that to a nonprofit agency that, again, that's part of a after-school program. Let's touch on one more thing if we don't have any other questions, because there's a dynamic between tier 1 and tier 2. There's also a dynamic in the nonprofit sector. Food banks typically are the heavy lifters. They deal with most of the bulk tier 1 food. Feeding America food banks typically have contracts with retail grocery companies, and they've been very good at setting those up and servicing them. But there's an element to it, especially for those maybe local retailers that aren't part of the Feeding America contract. Still, the idea of getting the nonprofit agencies that work with the food banks to do some of that work, to be able to pick up and getting them the resources they have. So I want to just share, that's kind of the dynamic. Food banks typically focus on the large scale distributors, processors, manufacturers, growers, and tier 1 grocery retailers, and using the nonprofit agencies, and then also sometimes doing it directly on their own. It varies by food bank and area. And again, now we look at the tier 2, that's a different animal, because it's all prepared foods, and it could be, it's the scariest one to work with. So we do have to take those steps to make sure that the food is safe, and we have to make sure that food's edible. So for example, in the past, we've had restaurants that will have a program in place, and their program includes throw everything in the freezer, and then once a week, somebody comes and picks it up. Well, after a few days in the freezer, it depends on what that item is and how it was wrapped or packaged. It could be, there could be freezer burn on it, or it could just no longer be edible or worth anything. So we want to walk through just the nuances of being able to make sure that donors know what to donate, how to do it. Food facility design firms that design restaurants, hotels, grocery stores, they are now starting to identify in their plans areas for food recovery, areas in a walk-in cooler or a freezer where that product is going to go before it's donated. So we've come a long way in a few years, but we're going to have to go much, much further to effectively satisfy the requirements of SB 1383. And there is a concern also, there's the difference between compliance and effectiveness. The threshold for compliance is one thing, but we want to be able to be effective. And that's why we mentioned, we want to eliminate the, just the kabuki theater of recovering food, burning up resources to get it to a nonprofit agency, burning up their volunteer resources to sort through it. And then ultimately we don't have much food to be able to feed people with, or it's not a source of nutrition. Absolutely. Mhm. That's a very good question. I'll repeat it. Yeah, I'll repeat it. Yeah, so everybody knows what the question was. In a remote area where there aren't a lot of resources to recover that food, what is the obligation? And regarding the contracts, how does that work? And the reality is that in certain rural areas where you don't have much access, you may have to apply for a waiver. In other words, we just don't have any resources here. We see this all the time. Or you have a contract, you have one potential nonprofit organization that could receive that food. That's who your contract's going to be with. But again, if it doesn't match, it doesn't match, and you're not obligated for that. You will be obligated to have that contract. In other words, you need to make that effort, and you've got to show that you've reached out to them to pick up, but they were unable to. And again, there are waivers that you can apply for. Certainly. So inspections, everybody across the state, I can share with you that everybody is scrambling to find out who's going to actually inspect this, who's going to be the agency that does the enforcement component of it. And I'm not sure if we have that worked out. Okay, just want to be honest. And across the state, we see varying degrees of interest from environmental health departments. So in some counties, we see environmental health taking a lead role. They're providing food safety education, training. Certain counties, the county I'm from in Orange County, they put the section of Cal Code, the California Retail Food Code, that allows and educates and informs about the ability to donate food. They actually put it on the inspection form. But they, a lot of counties will see themselves, environmental health, as regulators, not, not trainers. So they're not going back and inspecting. So right now it's to be determined whether it's going to be handled by the city, by the county, who's going to do that. But the reality is someone will be coming. And if there's any donors here, they know about the FOG program, fats, oil, and grease. It's very similar to that. We have to show that somebody is picking up this excess grease and oil, used oil. You've got to be able to show you have a contract in place with a service provider and how often they come and pick up. We're really kind of basically following that same model. The donor has to be able to show that they have a contract in place or multiple contracts, and that this is the pickup log.
So we have Steve Masson has another question. Please explain the waiver again. Most of the food we distribute is refrigerated, so the window past the sell-by date is very small. So if in doubt, throw it out. Do we need to apply for a waiver?
No, typically the waiver exists on rural areas where there is resources to pick that food up, unless you're in a rural area. And the state's going to make the assumption that if you're a distributor, you're good at getting food to where it needs to go, so you could get your excess food to where it needs to go. There's a lot of assumptions. That's one of them. There's also an assumption that if you're tier 1 or tier 2, you have excess food. And I can tell you in my industry, there are some operators that are exceedingly lean and seldom have excess food, but the state is going to assume you have it. So Steve, to your point, yes, you would still have to have a contract. You'd still have to make a good faith effort to be able to provide that. Now, you can safeguard that. In other words, you can pick and ensure or ask the agencies that you're going to work with to provide proof of what they're doing with that food and when they're moving it. It's well within your right. And I think it's just good business to protect your brand, to know when that food's going to be used. As a donor, especially as a distributor, I wanted to know where that food was going and what was their capacity to receive it. So when I was in the poultry industry, I would donate pallets of chicken, pallets of turkey products. Well, I wanted to make sure that an agency just wasn't taking it, throwing it in a cooler or freezer, and they were going to try to draw it down over a long period of time, because that would impact the quality of the product that had my label on it, my logo. So I would ask them to show ahead of time, where is this food going? Who's it going to feed? And by the way, share with me where it's, when it's gone, how much you've distributed. I think it's just good collaboration between the nonprofit and the private sector to make sure this food is of use. We're satisfying the details of the law, but more importantly, there's also those cost benefits.
Mike, do you have any advice for Steve on how we can prevent getting into that situation in the first place?
Yeah, like I mentioned, I would say, Steve, that first of all, we've done plans for private sector where we walk through, especially in retail grocery, in each department, what type of item. So for example, if you're talking about refrigerated perishable food, you're talking about proteins, dairy, produce. Some of these may have different internal processes. So for produce or something that's highly perishable, it's a lot easier. It's going to be there for one extra day and then it's out. If it's protein or maybe even dairy that has a longer life, the internal process might be different. It might be after 3 days or 2 days before the expiration date, we're going to move it on. Distributors typically have that because they need that product to get to their customer with enough time to use it. And in an assumption that they're not going to use it right away, they may be over ordering. So I would be more than happy to answer any questions or help out, but it's really a matter of always starts with that waste characterization study or donation study, which is this is how much excess we have and where it's coming from. Meaning if it's retail grocery, what department it's coming from. If it's a distributor, this is my perishable refrigerated, this is my dry goods, this is my frozen inventory. And that's probably the best way to address it. And then finally, I highly recommend knowing the partners you're working with so that you know where that food goes. And sometimes it creates a great atmosphere where you become almost a sponsor of that agency. Many times we've seen it through some of the larger distributors like a Cisco in the US where they'll adopt that pantry, so to speak. I have one in, I think, LA where they're re-racking the entire warehouse. Well, they're sending the racks to that same pantry that they started working with because it's a food bank with the warehouse, and they're going to send their old racking to that facility and augment what they do. So it creates different opportunities as well. So my contact information is there. Feel free to reach out at any time with questions. It's mike@aboundfoodcare.org. You're more than welcome to send me questions. And again, this is a process. We want everybody to get comfortable with how it works. Wanted you to know what the state is doing in mandating. Quite honestly, it puts municipalities in a really difficult spot. I'll be real honest, because they're the ones that are, they have stake in this. They're the ones that have to make certain that donors are participating. They have to report the data to CalRecycle, to the state of California. And also most cities lack the resources or are struggling with resources. So we've always maintained that you can't regulate your way out of this. This was a great opportunity to bring all the stakeholders together, but we've got to work together to be able to make this work effectively and protect brands and make sure there's cost benefits and value to everything we do. And then finally, what we always talk about is let's use that food to have an impact because it goes far beyond just feeding people for another day. There's an environmental side of it, and there's a nutrition source component of this. And when we merge both together, we have more resources and greater impact. Any other questions? Challenges are good also. Argue with me, that's fine. I love that. We've been doing this a long time, and it's really interesting how it has spread across the country. And where we started with it was, again, just the idea we didn't like wasting food. We wanted to donate it, but there were so many gaps in the system, and we needed to augment that system. And one thing is cold storage. So we've developed solar-powered cold storage, basically shipping containers used to move food around across the ocean, creating solar-powered units that you can put either in urban food deserts or in rural areas where there's a benefit. It's now a tool or a hub for food banks. It's also part of now an emergency food system where this excess food is created into meals, and now it's being placed inside these containers, and it's there for use in the event of a disaster. So in California, we're always worried about earthquakes. If that earthquake hits, where do we get our food? If you're talking about an urban environment where there aren't very many grocery stores, it's considered a food desert. This is a great tool and opportunity to have ready to either thaw and eat or heat and eat meals already there for that first 24, 48 hours when resources aren't available. Again, on a rural setting, it's an opportunity to be logistically more effective. Food banks can use out into that rural area where the food banks or the nonprofit agencies can then pick up. Yes.
Working with us specifically on the food recovery part, or are you going to kind of stick with us through the whole process where once we move into, exploring the commercial composting facility, all of that, is that kind of guys manage all of the regulations that are coming our way, or specifically?
So the question was, is Abound Food Care here to help with the food recovery part or all of the elements of 1383? Was that correct? Okay, we're here just for edible food recovery. That's our lane. So the first step for us, what we're doing is completing that capacity study, which identifies what's being done now, who needs to donate, how much there is to donate, who are the players that we need to rely on for that service, and then providing a roadmap, a guide of where it can go. And that's always our first step. Okay, any other questions? Did anybody mention anything about a raffle? No, it's because there's no raffle. We're out of luck. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike, for all of that. That was very helpful. So I'll touch a little bit on the question we just got about the other elements of SB 1383. But before I jump to that, I just wanted to go over what's next, what to expect. So Mike already touched on the capacity. It is our responsibility to make sure that when you reach out to our local organizations and say, hey, we need a contract to donate you food, that they can say, we have the capacity to do that. So that is what we're working on right now with the Abound Food Care. A report is being finalized on that. But very important to know that the tier 1 generators will need to have a contract on file by January 1st of next year. You were seeing a lot of January 1st, 2022, which is the statewide requirement, but the city of Eureka applied for 1 year leeway to delay our implementation, and we were approved that. So all the tier 1s have until January 1st, and then tier 2s are January 1st of 2024. I know we've got some school folks with us here today, so you've got a year and 6 months under your belt. As we progress with our project with Abound Food Care, we will provide template contracts if you need one, though we do understand a lot of food recovery organizations have their own templates they prefer. So that'll just be a case-by-case situation as you get into that. And then Donna Wood, our community services director, and myself, environmental project manager, we are both your main contacts for this mandate. So please save our information. We're here to help. We have physical business cards for folks here today, and folks on Zoom can go ahead and take a screenshot or picture of that so that you have that. So regarding SB 1383 as a whole, we actually have contracted with Edgar and Associates, and Abound Food Care is their subconsultant. So that's how we got hooked up with them. So Edgar and Associates is helping us with all the SB 1383 requirements. The big one that I know folks are waiting for is the curbside compost program, which is coming. HWMA actually just made a big decision to retrofit their facility to pre-process the organics before it goes to its final destination. So that is a big step that we're taking right now, is figuring out all of the logistics to retrofit that facility. There's actually a lot of other requirements that are a little less public facing. The city of Eureka will have to procure certain amounts of compost or mulch or energy from composting. So that's something we'll be working on the back end. There's a lot of monitoring, contract and ordinance requirements, all the boring stuff that we'll dealing with our attorneys and franchise hauler and all that. So it's a really big waste management mandate. People are saying it's the biggest in over 30 years, and it is unfunded. So we're really doing our best to try to get the information to folks, which is why we took the big step to bring Mike. So that's why we're recording this. So we'll distribute it to folks who weren't able to join us. So before we wrap up, does anybody have any other questions about SB 1383 in total, or any other questions they might have thought of after Mike stepped away? Now is the time. I'll give just a minute for Zoom to see if anybody chimes in. And you can go ahead and stop share, Lisa. Thank you. All right, I'll just give one more minute in case anyone's typing in the chat. Otherwise, I think we're about to wrap up. All right. Well, thanks for engaging with us today. And again, this is just the beginning of what we'll be doing together. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.